Hello, everyone. Today we're going to discuss Ice, chapters 1 through 4. You might have found it difficult to tell what's real and what isn't in this novel. The narrator tells us that he takes drugs for headaches and insomnia that cause him to have waking dreams, and there are a number of passages where he clearly appears to be hallucinating. The plot is suddenly interrupted by a bizarre vision, and then a few paragraphs later resumes. But everything in this novel feels dreamlike. From the narrator's relationship with this young woman with strange hair, to the climate crisis enveloping the globe. What I want to suggest is that it doesn't matter what's real in this novel or not. Everything we're reading seems real to the narrator. This is the world as he sees it. His view of the world might be dangerously warped, influenced by psychological problems and drugs, and maybe completely unrealistic, but we all see the world from singular, extremely specific perspectives, influenced by all kinds of things, and our view of the world might seem completely unrealistic to someone else. What Ice lets us do then is immerse ourselves very deeply in one mind. This novel, like other texts we've read this semester, raises serious questions about perspective. The narrator is trying to save the young woman from her husband, then from the man called the Warden, and from the ice taking over the world. But, as you've probably noticed, the young woman is trying to run away from the narrator like she's trying to run away from everyone else. So what kind of mind are we in? I think we're in the mind of a villain who really believes he's a hero. In the first chapter, as the narrator drives through the night to the house where the young woman lives with her new husband, he remembers their past relationship. I had been infatuated with her at one time, had intended to marry her. Ironically, my aim then had been to shield her from the callousness of the world, which her timidity and fragility seemed to invite. She was oversensitive, highly strung, afraid of people and life. Her personality had been damaged by a sadistic mother who kept her in a permanent state of frightened subjection. I treated her like a glass girl. At times she hardly seemed real. By degrees she lost her fear of me, showed a childish affection, but remained shy and elusive. I thought I had proved to her that I could be trusted and was content to wait. She seemed on the point of accepting me, although immaturity made it hard to assess the sincerity of her feelings. Her affection perhaps was not altogether pretense, although she deserted me suddenly for the man to whom she was now married. The narrator tells us he intended to shield the young woman from the callousness of the world. Why does he need to shield her? He gives us reasons. He tells us the young woman is timid and fragile and oversensitive, and she's been damaged by her mother. But remember, we are in his head. We are seeing the young woman as he sees her. He tells us she's a glass girl. Is he describing her accurately? He says, by degrees she lost her fear of me, showed a childish affection, but remained shy and elusive. So, the young woman's initial response to the narrator was fear, but he assures us she's learned not to be afraid of him. But she remains shy and elusive. So did she really get over her fear of him? Or is she simply still afraid of him? Then, he tells us she seemed on the point of accepting me, although immaturity made it hard to assess the sincerity of her feelings. Was it hard for him to be sure she was on the verge of accepting him because she's immature? Or was she just never going to accept him? And if she was on the verge of accepting him, why did she suddenly leave him for someone else? We're left with this question. Is the narrator describing the young woman as she is? Or is he describing her as he wants her to be? Later, when he meets her again in the company of her new husband, he says, her face wore its victim's look, which was of course psychological, the result of injuries she had received in childhood. I saw it as the faintest possible hint of bruising on the extremely delicate, fine, white skin in the region of eyes and mouth. It was madly attractive to me in a certain way. He's attracted to what he sees as her vulnerability. Why? Well, then someone needs to save her. He needs to save her. For him to continue to play this role of her savior, he needs her to continue to be vulnerable, to be a victim of something. For him to save her, he also needs her to remain in danger. At least, he needs to see her as being in danger. This psychological dynamic plays out on a larger scale in Chapter 2, when the young woman flees from her husband and seems to attempt to disappear. Her marriage was known to have been breaking up. Almost certainly she was better off now, and only wanted to be left in peace. Further investigation would be resented and lead to more trouble. This was a convenient view for them. It excused them from taking action. But I did not accept it. She had been conditioned into obedience since early childhood, her independence destroyed by systematic suppression. I did not believe her capable of taking such a drastic step on her own initiative. I suspected pressure from outside. The narrator does not believe that the young woman left her life behind of her own free will. He does not believe she's independent enough to have done something like that. Someone or something must have been pressuring her, forcing her to do this. Whether or not any of this has any truth, we don't really know. But what we do know is that if this view is convenient for anyone, it's convenient for the narrator. It allows him to go after her. It allows him to do what he wants to do. As the narrator heads out in search of the woman, the climate crisis that was in the background in the first chapter worsens. The narrator writes, "It was essential for me to find her without delay. The situation was alarming, the atmosphere tense, the emergency imminent. There was talk of a secret act of aggression by some foreign power, but no one knew what had actually happened. The government would not disclose the facts. I was informed privately of a steep rise in radioactive pollution, pointing to the explosion of a nuclear device, but of an unknown type, the consequences of which could not be accurately predicted. It was possible that polar modifications had resulted and would lead to a substantial climatic change due to the refraction of solar heat. If the melting Antarctic ice cap flowed over the South Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, a vast ice mass would be created, reflecting the sun's rays and throwing them back into outer space, thus depriving the Earth of warmth." In the world of the novel, it does seem like these global events are really taking place. But again, what's most important is how the narrator views these events. And what do all of these dangers add up to? It was essential for me to find her without delay. This narrator is a frightening, unreliable character, but he presents us with a big question. Do you see the world as it is? Or do you see the world as you want to see it, so that you can do the things that you want to do? The narrator arrives in another country, where a military official referred to as the warden is keeping the young woman captive. The narrator decides he has to save the young woman from the warden, and makes attempts to sneak into her room in the warden's house, almost like a fairy tale hero who has to save a princess from a dragon keeping her in his lair. But when the narrator meets the warden makes an odd impression on him. After having first glimpsed the warden from a distance, the narrator says, "This time my impression was more favorable. The arrogant look I disliked was less in evidence, although it was clear that he was a born ruler, a law unto himself, not to be judged by the usual standards." When the narrator meets the warden a second time, he thinks, "He was in far better condition than I was, and seemed to enjoy demonstrating the fact, looking back at me, laughing, showing off his fine physique. I did not quite trust this sudden good humor, but I admired his tough athlete's body, the wide shoulders and elegant narrow waist." The narrator has decided that the warden is a threat to the young woman, and he needs to save the young woman from the warden. But he also seems to admire the warden, almost seems to be attracted to him. Why? The narrator seems to recognize something, or come close to recognizing something. In spite of my original aversion, I suddenly had a curious sense of contact with him, almost as though some personal link existed between us. If the narrator were to rescue the young woman from the warden, how would the narrator then be any different from the warden? Does the narrator admire the warden because the warden has done what the narrator wants to do, make the young woman his captive? The narrator posits himself as the hero and the warden as the villain. But the real suspense in this novel might be, will the woman ever get away from the two of them?